What is going on, everybody? It is the Vanishing Mediators. It is Big Signorelli, aka Andrew. I'm here with Nick, and we have a special guest. This has been long in the making.
Long
Actual,
overdue.
yeah, long overdue. An actual, Vanishing Mediators, episode where we have the Dangerous Maybe on here. So our special guest, like I said, is the Dangerous Maybe, famous blogger on many such topics like Lacanian theory, Žižek, now stuff on Nick Land, and you're in the process of writing both a book and then also going to teach a course on Žižek, right?
Yeah, so the course on Žižek starts next Saturday. I'm teaching it at Theory Underground. If anybody's interested, they can go to theoryunderground.com and check out courses and look for Intro to Žižek. Primarily an intro to his theory of ideology. We're going to do four key works or key writings in his work. So I went and selected four chapters that I think are the best ones, or some of the best ones, on his theory of ideology. And it helps to do this with him because a lot of times in his books, I mean, we all know that Žižek can kind of drift around from topic to topic. And so to really get a good picture of his theory of ideology, besides reading Sublime Object, which I'm going to teach next year, besides that, he has chapters that are devoted to ideology sprinkled across his work. And so we're going to read some from Metastases of Enjoyment and Tearing with the Negative and Parallax View. So, but it's a 4-week course on Saturdays. And so, yeah. And then I just started doing a monthly seminar I'll probably do this until the day I die. Right. But, yeah, it's the Micky Downs. You introduced me as Dangerous Maybe, but Micky Downs, research seminar. And so I'm teaching that on a monthly basis. People can sign up for that too if they want.
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah. Yeah. You're doing a lot, and it's definitely
Staying
showing. Yeah, staying busy, and just the ability to be a working class, intellectual, organic intellectual, having to work a 9 to 5 job and then still have the time to not only teach but also write your stuff and then just read theory. Yeah. You're
Yeah,
setting the bar high for us too,
I appreciate it. No, I mean, it keeps me busy, and yeah, my first book is coming out sometime this fall. I had a finished version of it done, and then I realized I wanted to add a couple more sections, but it'll be out before the end of the year. It's called Capital versus Time Energy, a Žižekian critique of Nick Land. So it comes out sometime this year.
Nice.
I'll add that, Mikey, if I'm not mistaken, you might be one of 2 people to have ever interviewed Slavoj during work.
Oh, yeah, right.
Warehouse, right?
So, yeah, Slavoj, he wanted to help promote this course I'm doing at Theory Underground. So he was like, he told Dave McCarricker, founder, organizer of Theory Underground, friend, he told Dave, he's like, okay, but I'm super busy. I can only do it at blah, 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 which was, 12 Eastern. And so I was at work at the time. I was going to be at work. And so I was telling my manager, I'm like, I'm not going to be able to do this. And he's like, just use your lunch break, do it on your lunch break. So he helped me figure out how to do it. And so I was able to interview him while at work. So yeah, pretty cool.
That's awesome. Yeah. I don't even think I was able to do that. I think I've jumped into like Dave's like exegeticals at one point while I was like at work in the military. But yeah, interviewing Slavoj, that's
pretty fun. Yeah.
Anyhow, so we have you
Quilting point, right?
Yeah, on board today to talk about the quilting point. And I know you have a lot to say about the quilting point, especially from your perspective, from engaging with not only Lacan's work, but also Slavoj and Todd McGowan.
Yeah.
Just to kind of recap so far, we've just finished the quilting point chapter. We posted the exegetical video like a week or so ago. And just to kind of recap from this seminar, it seems that, Lacan is, he's introducing not just the symbolic, he did that in the last seminar, but he's introducing the term signifier and signified for the first time, and actually, in a sense, putting a thought in motion to it. And he obviously shows in chapters 10 all the way through 14 that we're not dealing with, a signifier signified relation, but what he'll build up to is like the signifier, lacks a referent, so you need another signifier for it to get its meaning. And so we've got this sort of split function of what the signifier does. It, refers to another signifier for meaning, but then there's also the level of what he'll talk about pure writing, that it's like this sort of note-taking process. It's a pure writing down. Like it has no meaning. It only gains its meaning when it retroactively comes back. And I think that's what leads into this notion of quilting point, because for Schreber, there is something like a signifier there, but it's obviously not functioning due to foreclosure. And another thing that he doesn't have is this notion of quilting, which Lacan brings up towards the end of the seminar. So if you could just walk us through, all of that, and your ideas on this seminar in total with the quilting point.
Sure. I mean, yeah, like we'll see where we get with this, but I'll start off by saying this, right? I think Lacan is right to make the signifier primary. Now, especially for psychoanalytic purposes, this is the right move. But the question is, for somebody who's listening, like, okay, what does that mean? Look, all this sounds rather abstract, but when you step back from it, you put the jargon aside for a minute, you realize that this stuff is fundamentally shaping our lives, right? This is not just abstract. Oh, the abstract signifiers of language. No, when we get into it, we'll see how much bearing this has on our lives. Look, as far as the thing with the signifier versus a signified, this is where, yeah, you said Saussure, right? Saussure and his theory of linguistics and semiology, right? He thinks that a sign is built out of a signifier and a signified. What that means is a signifier, I mean, and there's broader applications of this distinction, but let's keep it simple, right? So basically the signifier is the word, and he does this thing. It's a mental signifier, primary, a mental image, however you want to talk about the signifier. But for our purposes, we'll say the signifier is the word cat, right? Well, when I say the word cat, some concept pops in your head. Something is signified, and we have some concept of what it is to be a cat, what a general cat resembles, right? And so for Saussure, a sign is made up of both the word and its concept, the signifier and the signified, right? And then the whole question of actual cats out there in the world, that's a whole nother issue. If what you're interested in is meaning and how meaning functions, then the referent isn't as important, even though you grant that there are reference to the sign. If you're interested in how signification occurs and the structures of it, then you're going to focus on the signifier and the signified relation. For Saussure, he kind of puts them on an even playing field, even though he understands that they're separate and operate. There is a distinction. There's two levels to this, but there's a kind of equality he'll give to them, or at least kind of like seamless compatibility for the most part. Of course, you run into problems, but what Lacan figures out is no, signifiers are more important when it comes to signification than the signifieds themselves are, because the way I like to think about it is the level of the signifier is the hardware of language, and the signified is the software, right? So you got to have the hardware in place to have a software program up and running, right? And so the thing with the signifiers is you can think of them as the material base of language, opposed to the more idealist aspect of signification, right? And for Lacan, what you find is like the very arrangement of these signifiers, the arrangement of words generates meaning, and that it's not just two systems that operate in accordance with one another. The signification of a concept is always based on its signifier constellation, if you want to call it that. And we'll get into this more and more. I know this sounds abstract, but as we talk, we'll get into it more. And so the thing for Lacan that he starts doing in seminar 3 and is going to stay true all the way up in his work is that he realizes that to have any sort of stable system of meaning, there's what he calls quilting points, which are these primary signifiers, right? They're load-bearing signifiers that structure the field of meaning. And without these, and why does he call them quilting points? Well, it's point de capiton in French, which is the upholstery button, right? And so he gets this from upholstery where you take a pillow or a couch cushion, right? Traditionally, they would have buttons on them. And the function of the button was to stabilize the cushioning inside the pillow, keep everything in place, right? The button pops off, then the cushioning lumps up or it thins out and all that. So he's using this metaphorically to talk about how certain words in our language stabilize a whole field of meaning for us, right? So for him, the quilting point of all quilting points is what he calls the name of the Father. And the name of the Father is essentially prohibition. Now, you go back to traditional society, the literal name of your father actually organized the meaning of you in your society, right? So if you think about how we watch Game of Thrones or old movies, right? And they, blah, 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 son of, and then they name the dad, right? That was supposed to organize your meaning within that social order, right? Now, our last names don't really do this in the same capacity anymore. But nonetheless, there's a trace of it, right? There's on some level, it still applies to us, just to a lesser degree. But he's playing off this homophony in French, nom du père, right? The name of the father, but it's also the no of the father. It's it sounds the same, and so the name of the father, the no of the father. This boils down to the installation of prohibition into the psyche, that you can't do whatever you want, whenever you want, however you want, right? There's social protocols in society that you have to follow if you're going to be a functioning member of the social order, right? And if you don't have that signifier, the name of the Father, the no, if that's not a signifier that's fundamentally organizing your relationship to the world, then yes, you are a psychotic in Lacanian terms. There's a great quote from page 306 where Lacan says, "Observe this crucial moment carefully, and you will be able to pick out this passage in the onset of every psychosis. It's the moment at which from the other as such, from the field of the other," which here we can just say that's language or meaning, right? The order of signifiers. It's the moment at which from the other as such, from the field of the other, there comes the interpolation of an essential signifier that is unable to be received, right? So the fundamental interpolation, that the thing that gives us a sense of social duty, of putting a certain expectation on our behavior and how we behave in the world, it's the no of the Father. It's prohibition. If you don't get that, then you're never fully integrated into the symbolic order in the way that a neurotic would be. And so it's the signifier one has to get to be what we think of as a normal functioning member of the social space. Normal in quotes, because of course for Lacan, there's really no such thing as normal subject. The closest you get is being a neurotic. But yeah, without that signifier, your whole sense of meaning does not stabilize. So it's the anchoring point of all anchoring points. And as you grow up, you're going to have different things be your quilting point, or another term we're going to talk about is master signifier. You're going to have different signifiers that organize your sense of duty, your sense of who you are, your place in society. But all of them are based on this primary signifier taking hold in, for lack of a better word, the psyche, right? If you don't have that in your sense of your being in the world, then you're not really in the world in the fullest meaning of the word. So, but yeah, this idea. So here in seminar 3, he's going to talk about it in terms of quilting point. As Lacan's work develops, it's going to become master signifier, right? And so Žižek says in Less Than Nothing, the concept of point de capiton, quilting point, underwent many transformations in Lacan's later work before finding its definite form in the notion of the master signifier. Now, we know Todd McGowan's the great example. We know Lacanians who want to insist on there being a distinction between quilting point and master signifier. I am still of two hearts on this matter. I see the reason. Todd wants to say like the master signifier is the inaugural one. It's the first one. So you could say like name of the father is the inaugural master signifier of all master signifiers. And that what the quilting point does, it's the signifier that comes along and requilts or re-establishes a new order of meaning and dislodges the traditional master signifier, the inaugural one, from its position, right? So it's quilting point is a way of talking about how a master signifier gets replaced by another signifier. But then the problem is, it's like, well, the one that aren't we just talking about another master signifier? So I don't want to get lost in the details here because this gets real tricky. But so I think it's helpful just to know. You see, Žižek basically says no, quilting point and master signifier are the same. I think Lacan would more or less agree to that. I think Todd is just trying to get at some core nuance in how signification works between master signifiers, and that's important, right? I think that needs to be done. But I think for our purposes, let's kind of keep it simple and just say that master signifier is an conceptually evolved form of quilting point.
Right. And it's like one of the things that he says, Lacan says in seminar 3 in the quilting point chapter, is the way that what the quilting point does is kind of not the signifier and the signified relation together. So it's like we actually get meaning or signification from, the upholstery of the quilting, and that's where we finally see this condensing of an S1 to create not just signifying but signification in total. And you see that in analysis, because this is where the quilting point operates. And it's not that it's the same as the sort of variable length session, although the quilting point can happen where an analyst could be like, all right, we'll stop right there. But it's like, okay, you're free associating. The rule is to say whatever is on your mind, say anything, but not everything, because it's impossible to say everything. But you're sitting there on the couch and you're just talking and talking. Those are all S2s. Those are all just knowledge. Those are all just things that you think you know about yourself. But it isn't until like that rupture comes out, that a signifier comes out, that marks a sort of gap in meaning. So you have a sort of, we'll say, a signifier that stands out, that is like the moment of the unconscious. But like when that repeats over in time, then you see like at some point that some word ends up quilting in with this sort of association where it's like, okay, this association was like something that was forgotten about your past, and it could have been like a sort of traumatic event of being assaulted by your parent as a little kid, or like something traumatic of losing someone, or like, for example, in the seminar 3, I know he doesn't use this as an example of quilting point, but of this Hungarian patient who was a male hysteric who had these pregnancy fantasies, and recounts an event as a little kid of seeing through his basement window the neighbor giving birth, and the doctor's right there, and it was a stillbirth, so he was carrying the baby out of a body bag, or in a body bag, and he repressed that memory, and so it reenacted in all these sort of fantasies of being thrown out the train. And then it isn't an analysis that these memory functions come up as signifiers, but it's like over time when that repeats, it gets quilted into something, and that's where it's like the signifier finally condenses into meaning. And I'm saying just condensed, just like naturally, not like condensation in Freudian terms.
No, and I think that's good. I think that's right. I think that's what a trauma is, especially for the early Lacan. Is it's a failure to signify or signifierize something that occurs that you can't process, right? And that blank spot itself is what is this enduring thing of repetition that until you can that manifests itself in symptoms, and until you can integrate that into your psyche. I know I'm using psyche here, which
Yeah,
not the best term, but I mean it in this broad Lacanian sense that I'm giving it. And unless you can integrate that into your Borromean knot, so to speak, you're not gonna. It's gonna keep plaguing you, right? Now, right, like later on with the syntome and all that, it becomes a signifier that's just a pure concentration of jouissance, and he gets into these different distinctions later. But you know, I mean, look, I think as you get more into analytical practice, you're still going to go, okay, there might be something with the symptom, but there are also still traditional symptoms on some level that if you analyze them and you give them a signifier, you give them an interpretation and give them a space to occupy in conscious discourse that's registered, right? It does relieve the symptom. So I don't think we have to choose here between, you know, the two different images of the, you know, the traditional symptom as Lacan
Right.
thinks about it, and the symptom.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Definitely.
I want to.
But oh, go ahead, Nick. Sorry.
I want to touch on psychosis really quickly, because you said something interesting, and this is I think confirmed in the literature, has something to do with what our friend Paris Levitas describes as the critical mass of all quilting points, which would be the name of the father, the quilting point of all quilting points. And Lacan says some very interesting and somewhat cryptic things about this idea of the name of the father, but also the number of quilting points a person would have to qualify as neurotic, and therefore, in scare quotes, normal.
Mhm.
And he also talks about, in one of the lessons in 3, I don't remember which one, a stool, and whether a stool with 3 legs is any less of a stool than one with 4 legs. Pretty much saying, at what point does a stool cease to be a stool based on the number of legs it has? So I think that has something to do with the qualitative, or quantitative, I should say, slip dimension of the quilting point. And what it makes me think of as, or quilting points, is actually fantasy vis-a-vis this field of meaning, and the idea that perhaps psychosis comes about because, yes, the name of the father is foreclosed, but also it's as if there aren't the sufficient amount of quilting points to really be integrated into the social fabric of a society, ideologically speaking. And if you think about Schreber, it is at the point in his life where he is supposed to take up the mantle of his position as judge, that the issue of the name of the father and the lack thereof, like, kind of rears its head, because he cannot take on his position of being a newly appointed judge, and that this has something to do with what I think Lacan calls the absence of this model of virility for him. I wonder if you can
Well, it just boils down to the fact that the only way you can take on a duty at all is on the basis of the name of the father. Like, it's always going to be like, if you're dealing with an actual clinical psychotic, you know, say somebody's 30 years old and they're clinical. No, taking on a sense of duty isn't going to register with them. They can maybe try to imitate it, like it's this imaginary function where they look at somebody and they're like, I'm sorry. I mean, not to use the serial killer example for the psychotic, but Dexter Morgan in the show Dexter, right? He's a serial killer, but he's one who's born, he undergoes a traumatic event when he's a kid. He doesn't grow up with empathy. And so he's constantly having to mimic his way through social interactions, because on some level he just doesn't get them. So like all he can really do is pretend, right? And it's similar, same situation where, like, no, what what symbolic castration is, what the installation of the name of the father is this fundamental taking a position on the basis of some external authority giving you a command, interpolating you, right? Saying, no, you can't do that. There are expectations placed on you. You have to be willing to sacrifice some part of yourself, enjoyment, retroactively as it's taken to be, but you have to be willing to sacrifice something. And if this basic, which seems so like duh to everybody, right? But if this didn't take hold in you, then this whole idea of like trying to take on symbolic mandates, they don't have the same way. It's not the same you're kind of lost. Like, okay, like I have to pretend to be something, but I don't really get this. And so, I don't know. That's what comes to mind on that.
Well, what it makes me think of is like this idea of signifierness, which Lacan talks about in French. I think it's signifiance. So it's like there's signification, which is only achieved kind of provisionally thanks to the quilting point, but it's like the name of the father as being prohibitive in some way. It makes me think that there's this kind of background of meaningfulness that because the name of the father is what, or like a rigid designator, right? It's only refers to one thing at any given time, but it's contentless almost. If you really dig down into the meaning of the law, self-referential, right? It means nothing. It's the Kafka's door of the law. But for someone like Schreber, that is an issue. There is no background of meaningfulness that would, in some sense, be like the cornerstone of the ideological field of meaning.
So this is my thing. I just find it helpful. I think the term I came up with that I like for quilting point or master signifier is context setter. It sets the context of, and prohibition is really the context of all contexts within the social order, right? So you're not just establishing a meaning, you're establishing the context for all meaning to mean anything, right? That's what the name of the father as the context setter is. And again, like I think about when I say I don't care if it's you in the military, Andrew, or us having jobs or going into a marriage. All of these involve prohibition on the ability to understand that I can't do everything I want whenever I want. I have to engage in sacrifices. I have to make sacrifices, and everything is not organized around the immediacy of my pleasure or jouissance, either one. And so this reality principle is tied up with the name of the father. It's the context of all contexts in our social world is you cannot do whatever you want, whenever you want, however you want. And if that's not the fundamental context you're operating in, then you're not really in the world.
Right. And I'll say, like, just to add on with the quilting point and the context and meaning, especially with the military, it's funny that you said that because it's like, you get so lost in the everydayness of it. And like there's so many things that are just like routine. And sometimes you just like are like, what's the meaning of this? Right. Like you wake up, you put on this uniform, you go into ranks, and then you're told to do this and do that, and none of it makes sense, right? But then you're told, like, okay, you're in the military. Are we and you're supporting and defending the country, honor, courage, and commitment are our core values. Okay, there's some context and meaning, but it's like then it refers like, what does that mean to you? What does honor, courage, commitment mean? And it's like, oh, I care about my family, I'm committed to my family. But then it's like, what if you lose like a family member or something that holds that together? Well, then the military is all about war. So whenever there is a conflict, there's Al Qaeda, there's Hamas. That is the quilting for all quiltings right there, because it boils down to, as Slavoj says, the scapegoat. It condenses down into the ego ideal. And I think like that's like, another way where like, the quilting point happens where it generates to bring context in the neurotic. Even if there's loss, a new signifier comes up to create a context background for that meaning, so it doesn't lose everything like a psychotic does. Because Schreber doesn't have anything to hold that together. All these things are like so like different that there's no time to understand. There's no time to understand, and it doesn't have a sort of memory to hold that together, all these new like hallucinations and delusions.
Well, I mean, if you go watch, the YouTube videos of say like a catatonic schizophrenic, right? I've seen some of these YouTube videos. There's a fragmentariness to what they're saying at any moment, right? They don't seem to have an overarching consistency in their discourse. A lot of times schizophrenics jump from one thing to the next. And if there's some sort of logic to it, it's not any kind of logic that's recognizable to us, right? And so fragmentariness is one of the effects of lacking a signifier that provides cohesion and meaning to a whole field of meaning, right? So I mean, look, like, I mean, at the basic level, you know, we got to remember, like, the quilting point, its primary function is retroactive, right? There's I'll flesh this out, but there's like a cluster of things or elements. They're fragmented. They don't seem to have any cohesion. And then at the end of this, what a retroactive quilting point would do is knit them all together, is to give them a sense of consistency, right? And so on the basis of this retroactive function, that's where a whole collection of disparate objects or events can be given a systematic cohesion or consistency. Now, the funny thing is, this happens at the most mundane level of speech, right? So the basic structure of a sentence, okay, you take, you are the best, okay? We'll keep the same words, but we'll give them different punctuation marks. You are the best, okay? That's a period. You are the best, question mark. You are the best, exclamation point, right? Even though the four words are the same, the last mark of the sentence changes, it defines what the meaning is. Like it's almost like the meaning of the whole is in the last element, which retroactively goes back. It's almost like a time traveling signifier, right? It goes back and fixes the meaning of everything that came before it. And so this thing is so important. It's the fundamental structure of the most mundane of, you know, communication and sentence structure. On the other hand, it has everything to do with our lives and our sense of meaning. On the other hand, it has everything to do with the structure of our society. And so that's what I hope the examples that we'll talk about will get to is, no, this is a very pervasive concept that is at play in every aspect of our lives, and not just some, you know, abstract concept. So, but no, Lacan has this really great quote from Seminar 5 on page 487. And he says, the retroactive effect of signifiers acts upon the signifieds. Whatever form we give this term signifying chain, which could just be a sentence, like we just said, you are the best, right? As soon as there is a signifying chain, there is a sentence. And there is a sentence whenever something is complete at the level of signifiers. That is, all the signifiers that have been uttered in their place between the start and the punctuation. Meaning is formed when the final word of the sentence has been uttered. That's about as clear as Lacan is going to put it, right? And it's one of those great quotes tucked away in it. Like, so like you want the great quote on the, you know, what he's talking about in Seminar 3. Of course, it's tucked away in Seminar 5. But yeah, that's where he really gets to the heart of it, right? And but it's worth saying, right? So this whole thing with, okay, so there's this primary signifier that fixes, anchors, quilts, stabilizes a field of meaning, whether it's a sentence or whether it's a whole society, right? Someone like Derrida could come along and say, well, what you're doing is you're falling victim to what he'll call is the metaphysics of presence, right? And he'll say, oh, see, you're trying to get around the fact that meaning is always differed and differentiated, and you can never get to the final meaning of things. It's always a play of differences, etc. Right? You try to fix that by establishing something he calls a transcendental signified, which is like some pure concentrated meaning that really stabilizes and fixes all the meaning of everything else. So it's like pure concentrated meaning, right? And Lacan would reject this, and Žižek deals with this head on different occasions. And the point is, no, for Lacan, the quilting point is not like transcendent, pure Platonic meaning. It's a meaningless signifier. Like, it doesn't really have meaning. That's what you were getting at. It doesn't really have meaning in and of itself. It's a weird thing. The quilting point actively gives meaning to a field of meaning, but then that field of meaning retroactively gives the quilting point whatever meaning it has, right? And we'll see this when we talk about the political stuff. But the point is, no, it's just kind of a dumb signifier. It's a stupid signifier. There's no, the thing is not to turn it into some sort of like transcendent metaphysical Platonic principle. It's not that at all. It's a worldly, all too worldly signifier. What gives it its power is just its position in relation to other signifiers, not some pure access to some transcendent meaning it has. So it's important to realize that going forward, like, no, the master signifiers that have, largely influenced human history are just words, like other words, right? It's just the strange particular aspects of them, that for whatever reason work as to make them master signifiers. But it's not like, oh, we free ourselves from the burden of confused, blurry, vague meaning, and we get to something pure. Like, if we access, no, there's no hidden, secret, transcendent meaning to get from a master signifier, right? And I mean, look, the point is, right, the issue with master signifier is like, we don't agree on them. So do we all agree on what the word tree means, or the word dog? Yeah, we're not going to probably bicker much about what those words mean. I mean, somebody could be a contrarian and give a shit. Oh no, you do some sophist shit. What really is a tree? And I mean, or what is a bench? Can you have a bench that doesn't have any legs on it at all? It just hover. Yeah, okay, we can play those games too. But on a basic level, we all can agree on what tree and dog mean. Now, what about, is that the same thing when it comes to the words God, freedom, justice, goodness, nation, capitalism, communism? Now we're going to have some issues agreeing on what these words mean, right? And yet these words have largely structured human history, some in different areas, as in epochs and blah, blah, blah. But I mean, king would be another one, right? The monarch. And I think it's important, right? These are quilting points or master signifiers. But look, when we're talking about Lacan, like, somebody could go, well, wait, does the word king, is that what quilts, a monarchy, or is it the king himself? And the point is, there's really not a distinction. Like, the king is the signifier is the king for Lacan, right? Yes, you can make this abstract distinction between object, physical reference, and their signifiers, but the point is, there's a kind of fusion of the two for Lacan when it comes to the basic operational procedures of our symbolic order, which is to say that you can't really be a king and be effective as a king if you're not in the symbolic position of the signifier king, right? And yet it's hard to have the same dynamic. Like, you can have an object that's missing, like, okay, maybe this is the Hamlet principle, the whole thing with the primal horde that Freud talks about. Like, sometimes a signifier or symbolic position gets more power if the original thing is now dead or lacking, right? And think about it, like, okay, take God. I mean, has any word had more symbolic effect on the history of humanity than the word God? Probably not. But he hasn't shown. I mean, okay, I know that he was here 2,000 years ago, but you know what I mean. Like, he's not just here, in that kind of sense. And you could say, well, maybe it's because he's not here that's what lets the word have so much power. But the point is, the point is the thingness of the thing only counts in our social order on the basis of it being a signifier for Lacan. And so I know it's like somebody could say, well, okay, is capitalism our master signifier, or is capital itself MCM prime? But there's really no difference from this different position, because the point is how the thing as a signifier is functioning within the social order. So, you know, that's the thing. And I'll hold up for a second before we go to the examples. But yeah, it's important to realize, like, most of these master signifiers that we recognize as these elevated or privileged terms, if you ask, we're getting at some pure no, it's almost if anything, there's so much meaning attributed to them that they don't mean anything at all, because nobody can agree on what the hell they mean. So
Well, I think it's helpful to bring it around at this point because this is something that Nick and I have been grappling with and kind of comparing with the first chapter of For They Know Not What They Do. Because what is Slavoj doing on this chapter called The One, but giving a sort of not only a defense of Hegelian dialectics, but also giving a homology between the notion of the one, its movement, and the signifier, the logic of the signifier, and the logic of MCM prime, or like of the capital and commodity, and that its movement is always one of a double inversion, double reflection. So it's like we never get at this pure meaning of the master signifier, but the movement of the master signifier is determined by the way that it's always inverted, because what does the signifier do? But it represents a subject to another signifier, and the subject is always trying to speak to the other. And so the other reverts back that message in an inverted form, as Lacan would say. So it's like, the meaning comes already in totality of invertedness, right? Nothing pure, but something that's always like inverted by meaning.
mm-hmm.
Yeah, if I could just add to that, it's like, I think in that chapter, we get one of the best treatments of this concept of the signifier that's out there. And I think that the unnamed protagonist of the analogies he's using is actually the optical schema, because there's at one point he does talk about like the real image in one of the parenthetical additions he has in one of his one of the sentences there, and it's like he is striving in that chapter to explain how reality itself is constitutively inverted and how that's revealed by the quilting point. And of course, he uses Lacan's example of Racine's play, Athalie, however you say it, and this idea of fear. And yes, Big Sig just sent me in the topsy-turvy world, but this idea of fear, which quilts all particular fears. And I remember Slavoj says in that chapter, we begin with an imaginary sort of dichotomy between like earthly life and the life to come that is in that play. But what replaces that is a fear which contextualizes all earthly fears. And somehow that is what hooks the imaginary to the symbolic. So it seems to me that there is this kind of like antithetical function of the quilting point, this mirroring into itself, this double reflection. I'm wondering what you make of that dimension of the quilting point, the way Slavoj treats it.
Yeah, I mean, look, the stuff on the double inversion, because yeah, I mean, I taught that a year ago, or a year and a half ago, For They Know Not What They Do. And I guess for me, the way I kind of boil down what's going on with double invert, where it's helpful for me, is to think it in terms of Derrida versus Hegel. And so, because I mean, there's a lot he's doing in that book with double inversion and everything. But one of the things he gets at is, look, Derrida could say, look, I'm doing more or less what Hegel did, because I'm showing how things break down, and that signification is always differed onto another signifier and then onto another. And I'm showing the aporias that, language runs into and all this. And so deconstruction seems like dialectics, but what Slavoj does is like, okay, so you start off and you think that there's like some simple pure meaning, and then you do this kind of deconstruction a la Derrida, or you do dialectical analytics like Hegel. And what you do is you say, okay, that pure identity that we started with, we're going to invert it now, and we're going to see that it's split from within, that it's structured by difference, that it's fundamentally mediated. It's never fully identical to itself. It can't live up to its own ideal image of itself, so to speak, right? But Derrida stops there. So he inverts it once. He goes from some claim of something having a pure identity into having this kind of mediated, differentiated status, right? Shot full of contradictions and aporias. And then Derrida stops. And Žižek says, no, but he misses the true Hegelian gesture, which is the next inversion, which is to go back retroactively and see that that identity that you started with, actually, this whole process of how it fails to be itself, that's its real identity. So the quilting point comes at the end of showing how something is not its fully itself, that it's dialectically split, that it's deconstructible, and the way it is specifically that it deconstructs itself is its identity, right? That's the second, and that's how he would quilt that, and how so a basic example, take the sense certainty section from Phenomenology of Spirit. So Hegel starts off the book, he wants to find something that's pure and immediate, and knowledge can express in the thing's pure singularity, right? And so, well, what else is pure or more unmediated than looking at an object and going, this, right? You don't name any of its properties. You don't go, that thing over there that's red and big and blah, blah, blah. You just say this, right? Well, this is the attempt to name the thing in its pure singularity, right? Issue is that when you start to say this in language, you start to realize, but wait, I say this about this, and then I say this about this object, and then I say this about this object over here. So all things that I'm trying to name in their singularity are being named with the most universal of terms, which is this. And the same goes if you try to do this with moments in time, you say now, now, now. Well, I want the now to name the singular, but what it really names is the universal, right? And so Hegel's going through this whole thing with sense certainty, and at the end of which he's dialectically brought sense certainty to this realization that it cannot live up to its own ideal of itself, right? But the point retroactively is, yeah, and that is what sense certainty's identity is. It's the way its identity and difference form an identity that is split or dialectical, right? That's the second inversion. So you can view Phenomenology of Spirit when you get to the end of each section. So he starts off, so instead of doing thesis, antithesis, synthesis, be more accurate to do identity, contradiction, identity in contradiction, right? Something like that. And so that's this idea that he's doing with this second inversion or double inversion, and for they don't know what they do. And for me, that's the core way of thinking about what, and of course he talks about it in different ways, does different things with it, but that's kind of what it boils down to. And so, yeah, the quilting function is at the heart of dialectics for Slavoj. That dialectics is always, once you've done a dialectical analysis, you're going to, in a sense, travel back in time to its original identity, what it posits to be identity, and give a new meaning to that identity that, with sense certainty or perception thought they were, but really weren't. This disavowed otherness within them has to be integrated into the very identity.
Yeah, and I love that dialectical investigation, the way you broke it down, because like from reading, sense certainty and force and understanding, and comparing it with the sort of investigation that, let's say, Freud is doing, all of the interpretation of Lacan, it's almost very synonymous to a sort of dialectical investigation. Even though Freud is not a philosopher, there is some philosophical merit to his scientific investigation. And what I'm thinking is like he goes like from the early work. Let's talk about the Entwerf Project of the Scientific Psychology. And I know Nick has been delving into that a bit, but like he starts off with like thinking about excitation and the body, and that the baby hallucinates this object, the mother's breast, and it's not like it isn't without a real object, but like there's a sort of hallucinatory function to build a sort of, let's say, pleasure principle within reality, sort of reality testing. And then like later on, he then will talk about things like with the unconscious, dreams, and then instincts and their vicissitudes to talk about the drive. And it's interesting that in Beyond the Pleasure Principle, not only is he radically thinking of something new with this notion of the death instinct or the death drive, but he retroactively goes back to that primordial event of a hallucinatory object with the same schema of primary and secondary process from the Entwerf. And it's from a dialectical thing because he's realizing that this constituted object of hallucinatory satisfaction is already split to begin with, because this totality is inverted based upon the absence of the mother. Let's look at Fort Da. The absence of the mother brings about the presence of a replacement object, but then that sublates into this game of oscillating presence and absence, which is, oh, I found the object. This is not it. Go away. And this is the way that the signifier creating a totality of an inverted reality that wasn't there to begin with to handle, let's say as a little kid, if you're in the imaginary, just colloquially speaking, then like you're dealing with frustration of not having that object. So it's like you're sublating frustration into castration. And I'm thinking in terms of like Seminar 4 when he uses frustration, castration, privation. But totality is already inverted, and you only get that movement of that based upon the signifier, because it is both the murder of the thing, but also preserves the thing at the same time, keeping totality, but also masking absence. And I think that for Freud, that was a very dialectical move to not only see that, but retroactively go back to his prior work while also adding the sort of presence and absence or refining of an object that you see in Beyond, no, not the 3 essays of sexuality, where the child is mapping their own erogenous zones with, what is pleasurable and what is painful.
Yeah, no, look, I think this is why Žižek sees this strong affinity between Hegelian dialectics and psychoanalysis, is because, look, on the one, like you can almost say both subjective destitution and absolute knowing get you to the same place, which is to say there is no pure, unmediated, blissful origin to return to. It's a construct of fantasy, and like we're looking for that, but reality itself is fragmentary and contradictory, etc. And so this idea of like, oh, I'm constantly searching for the thing that'll give me it, right? The point, you didn't have it to begin with. You think you did because of symbolic castration, and then you concoct fantasies and blah blah blah, and it convinces you that you gave up. You didn't lose anything, right? That's the problem, is that you have to be integrated in the social order. You think you gave up your jouissance, but you didn't really lose anything at all. So, but you retroactively take yourself to have lost something. And so absolute knowing is essentially reconciling yourself with the fact that all is contradictory, and that there is no absolute pure ground or beyond to access, right? And the psychoanalytic thing would be like, look, it's coming to deal with the fact that the other itself can't give you what you think it can give you. It's lacking too. It's contradictory. And so it's an attempt to kind of get yourself to come to terms as best as possible with the fact that there is no pure, unmediated jouissance or beyond to have. Like, you're driving yourself crazy. You're overly neurotic because you want something that you can't have. Like, and so some part of it would be a relief to just go, look, I'm suffering neurotically in an excessive way, precisely because of the fantasies and the deadlocks of my desire and blah 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 blah. The point, as Freud says, is basically to return the patient to ordinary unhappiness, right? Which is just to say, like, okay, I'm never going to be fully happy. I'm never going to have this elevated pure access to some higher form of enjoyment or immediacy, right? And that's in a, on the level of libidinal economy, that's what Hegel's doing with absolute knowing at the level of like theoretical conceptual consciousness, right? The beyond you're seeking is in you. You're the one torturing yourself with this thing. It's not out there to have, and the other can't fix it. You're doing this to yourself. So that's where you would kind of see the two overlapping in a sense. But but okay, so hold on. I think this is helpful. This is from seminar 3. So I think it's good to give these kind of concrete examples, because that's what we do. We start talking jargon and we know it, but like, let's back out a little bit. Okay, look.
Does the
So,
other know it?
right, yeah, exactly. So, okay, we can do a geographical or urban example of the quilting point. Lacan does this himself. It's the highway, right? So try to take yourself back before the highway system was built in America. And you think all you have is like these dirt country roads, right? And trying to have any sort, you have to be really immersed in the local community to know your way around those back roads, right? Well, as the highway system gets built, it finds its way into different populations and different cities, urban settings. And in fact, it helps to create these urban settings in a lot of cases. But what the highway does is it gives you an overarching context or orientation within your city, right? So no matter where you're at, you can find yourself in some lost part of the city. But if you find the highway, that's your North Star, right? It gets you back into your integrated space of basic spatial familiarity with where you're at. And so, like in Kansas City, where I live, our 3 main highways are I-70, I-35, and I-435. And I don't care where I'm at in the city. If I find, there's I-35, I know where I'm at. Right? It structures and orients all the geographical meanings for me, right? And I mean, maybe the greatest example of this in America is how the 405 functions in LA, right? So I've got a friend Bly, who lives out in LA, and he describes this, and he's told me that there's areas in LA you just can't get from one to the other without going on the 405. Like there's no back roads. Like it's like they're completely fragmented and sectioned off in that way. And it's only the 405 that gives the city this kind of sprawling consistency. And you take the 405 away, a lot of these different areas you're not going to really be able to access getting one to the other. And so I love that idea. I think, I mean, architects and city engineers and all that, I think they often are thinking in terms of master signifiers, and they don't even know it, of course, but that's what you're trying to do, is find ways of providing a fundamental spatial orientation context setter in how people get around and move about their city. So I think that's a great example on Lacan's part.
Sorry, the mic went off for a little bit, but yeah, no, that's a perfect example too. And you can even think of like Route 66 as another example using highways. But I think like quilting it, no pun intended, back to another example which you brought up earlier was like the example of the name of the father and the master signifier sometimes literally being the name of your father. And how that is passed down. And like one of the things that I really like that Daniel Tutt does with like his book on the family is that he shows that this isn't just abstract shit. This isn't like how some people that are not psychoanalytically oriented will criticize psychoanalysis as being something individualistic, but that the subject or what this patient's symptom is a sort of focal point for like all sort of social symptoms, and that the family is the site for capitalist and bourgeois hegemony to introduce those prohibitions. And sometimes it's in that name of the father. And I'll use my own example that, like, I think I've told both of you many times, like, I'm a junior, so I carry my father's name, and my father was an ex-con. All he knew was crime. All he knew how was to sell drugs. All he knew was being in and out of prison. And so, like, when he finally was out and I was like, young, and he was raising me, he would always say, like, you carry my name, like, I've built a name for myself in these streets. If I go to this hood and that hood, everybody will respect me. So when you walk out there, you're representing me. So, like, a lot of these symptoms that I talk about in analysis have to do with, like, a sort of, notion of traversing what masculinity is for me and what it means to be a man when I have to represent that name, because there's so much like symptomal investment or libidinal investment in the name Andrew Flores. And with the sort of impossible demand that was put on me. He used to say, like when I used to fuck up a lot, the only way you'll ever be a man if you keep fucking up like that is if you end up in prison or joining the military. And so, like, there's not only like the sort of master signifier unary trait of the name Andrew Flores or Andrew Flores Jr., but also one of the things that's important with this name of the father or the no of the father, which operates in Oedipus, which is demand, and the other's demand that gets signified onto you.
Totally. I mean, there's lots to say there. I mean, on the one hand, look, what part of your story, I mean, and it's part of all our stories. So you have your sense of like, if your dad's around, you're going to orient yourself around like what he thinks being a man is, right? But then you're going to get into different social situations where they have
Yeah.
different ideas of what it is. And so, and the problem is, whether it's your dad or a mentor or a
Right.
teacher, you know, if you really start questioning them, at some point you're going to go, what do you really want from me? What am I
Yeah.
supposed to do here? Right.
Yeah.
And so they think they're being clear, but in truth, and this is the encounter with the Lacan and the other, they're not absolutely sure themselves about what it means to be the man or to do, And so you have different others who are in authoritative positions telling you to be the man. They're not consistent in what
Mhm.
it means to be the man, not among each other and not even with themselves half the time. And so this is one of these moments where part of what can drive us crazy is trying to fulfill these demands when we really don't even know exactly how to do them. Like,
Mhm.
because the point is you can try to fulfill the demand and you think like, wow, I knocked it out of the park. And then the authoritative other is like, you fucking let me down. That was terrible. And you're like, well, what the I did it till I followed your command to the letter, and somehow I still got it wrong. So part of what analysis is going to try to do is to get us to free ourselves from the other in this way, where it's like, yeah, like I can't base my whole behavior in the world on trying to follow some sort of interpolative demand of the other, because they really aren't sure about what this means, right? And so that kind of undermines that. The other thing I was going to say that so yeah, I mean, look, on the side of, there are people in our philosophy circles that will say, well, you Lacanian guys are necessarily conservatives, right? And look, we know the Deluso-Guattarians will say we're conservatives, right? Because, and it's because we go, okay, not so fast, right? That's what makes us conservatives. Now, what do I mean by not so fast? Like this idea of just deterritorializing all authority and all law and all prohibition, right? And that, we deterritorialize and decode all this, somehow brings about the new earth where things are set right and desiring production can just flow along uninhibited. Um, that's where we go not so fast, right? And it's because there's this tendency that certain leftists have. A lot of them are inspired by Deleuze. Some of them don't know Deleuze and Guattari, but this idea of just, oh, abolish the family, it's Oedipal, it's blah 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 blah, and this is where you get into trouble with trying to organize some sort of like working class politics, because the family is a fundamental master signifier for so many people still. So, and that's the point, right? When I say master signifier, I mean orienting principle. Like it is what structures their whole world. So if you just come along and go, the family is an oppressive structure, let's abolish it, let's get rid of it, they feel fundamentally assaulted by you. Because what you're really doing is stabbing at their master signifier. And then you wonder why they don't like you so much. Because this is the only meaning they have. Like the thing that keeps so many people going in life is fighting to give whatever decent life they can to their family, and just going, oh nope, family's an oppressive structure, you're a fucking Nazi or a conservative or a fat, whatever you want to call them, because the family is their core center of meaning. You just lose the vast majority of working class people if you're going to attack the basic institution that provides their life with concrete meaning, right? So that's where it's like, okay, sure, there's issues with the family. I'm not denying that there's, the father can be, a tyrant in certain situations. The mother could be overbearing in others. They could be blah, blah, blah. There's all these, I get it, right? But if the solution is family bad and oppressive, get rid of it. Don't be surprised when you also get rid of all the people you were hoping would support you.
I'm wondering if what we could do at this point is get your thoughts on the distinctions between what I'm seeing as like 3 different kinds of quilting point, or 3 different uses of it.
Okay.
And they're all interrelated, but you've got purely linguistic quilting point, which would be punctuation, like you were saying earlier, whether it's a exclamation point, period, question mark. The quilting point in the psychoanalytic session, and then the, let's say, like hotly debated concept of the quilting point in ideology critique. Slavoj has his take.
Yeah.
Todd has his take. Do you think it's useful to make these distinctions? And if so, where are we going?
Ultimately, you have a signifier that's performing the same function. So, look, quilting, as far as a psychoanalytic thing, look, I understand, like, through the work of analysis, the patient comes to be able to narrate aspects of their life that they previously were unable to, and basically you're bringing the deadlocks of the symptom into a meaningful discourse about yourself, right? And that can help alleviate the symptom. So there's that. For Lacan, the real core quilting point is scansion, or the ending the session abruptly, right? Because he's going to use it methodologically or practically to basically where he ends a session abruptly, it's gonna stick with the patient where it ended, right? So he'll use the ending of it just like a period, right? He'll use the abrupt ending to fix the meaning of everything that happened by putting the emphasis on whatever they were just talking about at the end of it. So say the patient reveals something, or there's a slip or whatever, and Lacan wanted to highlight it, boom, end it, and therefore quilt that last part as the quilting point for the rest of the session. And hopefully that will stick with the patient until the next session. And then they'll come back and be like, yeah, I didn't realize it at the time, but man, like that was getting at something. I didn't, so that's the application there. But in a sense, that's Lacan's approach to using it for scansion, or whether it's the period or the question mark in a sentence, or it's how, let's talk about ideology and politics for a minute. It's still going to be used in the same way. So just on a broader scale, right? So, look, at the level of the sentence, we're talking about like a micro level of retroactive quilting, right? At the level of symbolic or political formations, it's the macro level of how the retroactive signifier is functioning. But ultimately, it's the same retroactive mechanism. So look, Žižek in Sublime Object and other places, but the famous thing is in Sublime Object, says, look, when you start evaluating what society is, what you find is that society is basically a field of disconnected, fragmentary struggles, right? So you could have feminist struggles, women's struggles, right, for emancipation. The economy is a constant struggle. There's race struggles, right? LGBTQ, war, poverty, the environment. There's the struggle, the struggle of what the meaning of the future is going to be. Like, where are we going in society? Where are we headed? Right? These are all core issues that a society faces, and yet, when taken almost in their raw form, they don't really seem to have much connection to one another. And if that's the case, then you're just with a bunch of fucking problems that you don't know where to start with. And so this is going to get to the whole thing with what you talked about, the fear of God, the fear of the Lord, right, as a signifier. So look, in that example, you've got a guy who's plagued with fears. He's almost phobic, right? He's afraid of this and afraid of that. I'm afraid I'm going to get ill. I'm afraid I'm going to blah, blah, blah. I'm afraid my family's going to die. Like, somebody constantly bombarded with a multitude of fears. Okay, if you're stuck in this kind of chaotic web fragmentary web of fears that just keep assailing you, one way to quilt them and to get them all stabilized and under control is to fear the Lord, to fear God. Because if you fear God, what this is doing is going, I am going to serve God. I fear God. And by being interpolated, taking that on as your symbolic mandate, being a man of God, a woman of God, you say, okay, I'm in God's good graces because I bow to him. My will is his will. Anything that now happens to me, it's for my good. Like, God is protecting me. God is in control. And so I don't have to fear these things anymore. And that's how this fear of the Lord or fear of God as a quilting point functions. It requilts this whole field of fears and makes it where you don't really have to fear them because you've exchanged them with one fear, which is God himself. But if I accept that one fear, I don't have to fear the other ones. Yeah, maybe I'll something bad will happen to me, but ultimately it's for my good because I've bowed and submitted myself to God. So, but what you're seeing is there's a new overarching cohesion to all of these fears now because I've quilted them, I've stabilized their meaning with my fear of God, right? Well, something similar has happened in this field of political struggles or social struggles, right? If you say, look, we have all of these ecological problems, feminist issues, LGBTQ, poverty, race, right? Well, okay, if you take the word communism and you plug it in, it's going to give us a cohesion or consistency to what ought to be done about these issues, right? It's going to quilt them into, they're all in a sense take on a communist valence, right? A communist association or connotation, right? And now you've quilted the field into a coherent system of meaning. Now, so communism is going to give, basically, if you make communism the key signifier, it's going to give you different answers to each one of these: race, LGBTQ. Ecology is going to be C. Capitalism exploits the planet. We've got to stop, industry from polluting and dumping waste and blah blah blah. It's going to have a communist type of approach to ecology. With feminist struggles, it's going to say C. Women have been economically placed in this position where they've been subservient based on the class structure and the aspect of how patriarchy plays into the class structure. And so it's going to basically approach these things in a different way, but with consistency. Now, if you take capitalism and plug that in, you're going to get different answers to what to do about all of these things. Well, actually, we don't have enough market. We don't have enough competition. So actually, if we went more in a laissez-faire direction, it's going to blah, 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 right? Same goes with other ones, right? So no, we need to bring back Christianity, and instead of capitalism or communism, we need to make Christianity the core of our society. Well, that's going to give you a different answer to gender issues or to class issues, blah, 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 blah. So the point is, that's why communism, capitalism, Christianity, why it's so hard to get all of us on the same page when it comes to what they mean, because really their meaning isn't in they're like just a simple, oh, a tree is a tree, a cat is a cat, right? It's in how they organize society. And then different people we're not going to agree on whether or not that specific organization is a good thing or a bad thing. And so we're going to fight over that. And then you're going to have distinctions within what communism actually is not this state oppression thing. It's a stateless society. Well, capitalism really isn't the ruthless exploitation of workers. It's really about the emancipation of the individual. People are going to constantly fight over what these words mean, and then you're going to try to have to go to other master signifiers or quilting points to stabilize them. So then you're going to qualify them like corporatism instead of capitalism, or corporate capitalism opposed to laissez-faire. And so you get into this whole requilting thing, and there's no easy way to deal with it. But what is important is to be able to stand back and go, but I see how retroactivity is at play in all of this, right? I see that politics is largely a battle over what quilting point is going to be the quilting point. How are we going to organize the social order? And right now, especially in America, there's just less and less of a consensus, which means there's less and less of a general quilting, right? So that's part of what's at stake when it comes to the quilting point in ideology and politics. The one thing I'll just say is the trick we got to remember is that society in its raw form really is just a bunch of disparate, fragmentary struggles, and that ideology is not just false consciousness in the Marxist sense. Ideology, like every quilting point, whether it's communism, capitalism, democracy, Christianity, they're all ideological in the sense of once they impose the consistency on the situation, we think that, oh, like that's it, right? Like the it's closed. Like now this is just the way things. That's not just the way things are. There can always be a requilting of these kind of free floating social elements, and so different institutions, like their meaning isn't fixed once and for all. But every quilting point it taps us into ideology, because it makes us think, oh, this is it. This is the order of things, right? And on the one hand, we need that kind of ideological perception of things, because if we're constantly worrying about, oh, everything could be undone and everything's susceptible to requilting, then we're going to have this anxiety plague us. And so there is a comfort in ideology, but this is where, like Žižek would say, yeah, and that's part of it. It's not like we're going to do ideology critique is not to like do away with ideology once and for all. It's to understand how ideology functions so as to navigate it and to hopefully, basically, look, I can sum it up like this. It's not a choice between ideology and no ideology. The Žižekian struggle is between better ideology and worse ideology. So,
what came to mind when you said communism is a kind of quilting point of all of these disparate but nonetheless related struggles, this false notion of like cultural Marxism is almost like a kind of bizarro quilting point that was popularized by Jordan Peterson, where it's like in one fell swoop he's able to combine identity politics, postmodernism, and the entire history of Marxist ideologies in like one handy dandy term that just was used by like a lot of right wing guys to just sort of dismiss wide swaths of ideologies that have not much to do with each other.
yeah. Well, no, and I mean, part of it is, I mean, that's why there's always this temptation of the stupidity of the master signifier. It makes things clearer. It does. Like that's why Žižek's example of it is from Jaws, where in his analysis of that, where he's like, look, you have a town, they have all kinds of little issues. The kids are breaking down fences and blah blah blah. But it's the same thing as the fear of the Lord thing. Like the second the shark shows up, you can exchange this multitude of little local problems for one big problem, and that makes things clear. There, even though you have a bigger problem with the shark, the space of intelligibility, your cognitive mapping is far less cluttered. Like, okay, just get rid of shark. This was the temptation that worked on the Germans with anti-Semitism. Like, okay, we have a whole economy that's falling apart, a social order that's in decay. We our national identity is fluctuating. We can't get it. Blah 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 blah. Oh, it's the Jews, right? It immediately makes things come into sharp relief. It's ideological. It's not gonna. If you try to, get rid of the scapegoat figure, it's not going to bring about apparent. And that's the thing, right? There is no lost bliss to return to, and so that's why, like, this ideological function of the scapegoat is always such. That's why I always am hesitant and guard against that. Like, I always want to resist any type of any instance I see of that, because look, I'm not saying that every instance of scapegoating is going to lead to something that's terrible as the Holocaust, but it's just it's ideology at its purest and its worst. And no matter what the situation is, even if it doesn't involve, concentration camps, the point is it's dumb in the sense of its misdirection. The issues are the structures and contradictions of society. That's where the real core work has to be done, is in addressing those issues. And blaming some specific group, it's a scapegoat, it's never going to make anything better. It makes it simple, it makes it understandable and cognizable, but it's also false, right?
Mhm.
And so that's where that's the type of ideology Slavoj always is trying to warn us against. Like, we do not want to fall into that trap. Um, but if in the other sense of, like, taking our social order to kind of be a closed hole, like, yeah, there's like a comfort in that, and so that's why he sees a certain necessity to ideology, basically like a buffer against the real. Like, if we're just hanging in the real of there's all these contradictions, there's all these tragedies, there's all of the, like, it becomes unbearable. So this is where there's a at least a dual function of ideology that is at play. But the core thing is to realize it's always that functioning, both of them, pinned down by quilting points, and we can take on a different ideological formation, a different social order, if we requilt it in different ways.
Yeah, and this makes me think of like two things that you pointed out with this example of quilting point. On the one hand, when we talk about it on the level of ideology, you mentioned the way that a Marxist will use class to organize the sort of phenomenon that are happening that don't seem to have an explanation, whether it's the problem of race, the problem of gender oppression, these sort of crises that are happening with capitalism. And then on the one hand, the example of scapegoating. And so the two things that are coming up with this concept of quilting point, one, the quilting point can be ideological in the sense that it can conceal the real antagonism that's going on. And so when we use a scapegoat, we could just sum everything up and there's like, oh, done deal. Now this, the problem of everything is the Jew. The problem of everything are these, blue-haired cultural Marxists that want to police language. And then on the other hand, we have something that is not without empirical investigation, meaning the class struggle, which Marx, through his empirical and dialectical investigation, came up with the class struggle. And that is something that is like a sort of reductive, as like the people that accuse Marxists of being vulgar, of economic determinism, but something that's like a vanishing mediator, that without this sort of lens, ideological lens, we can't be able to coherently organize the problems of the social relations. And so why I'm saying this is because for psychoanalysis, it's like, okay, this quilting point helps us both realize what is being sort of obfuscated from the reality of your enjoyment. But then at the same time, if we realize this repetitive master signifier that comes up, we could organize it in a way to help investigate what is the problem of your suffering.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. I mean, look, Žižek is pretty clear on this in Sublime Object. I mean, look, because I kind of want to riff off of what you just said. For him, class struggle is the struggle. This is where he remains a Marxist. Like, sure, there are all kinds of struggles we're facing in society, but the core issue is class. And I think sometimes we just say class struggle and leave it at that. I think it helps to flesh this out. Okay, so on the one hand, class struggle is not just something happening in capitalism between working class and capitalists. Class struggle is something that goes all the way back. And what it really is a struggle over is who's got to do the fucking work and who doesn't. Right? Because the second you start to have a society that moves beyond the primitive communism, if we want to call it that, the tribal society, right? The second a surplus is being produced, the question is who does the work to generate the surplus, and who gets to have control over the ownership or distribution of the surplus, right? And so you get into this whole structure that is a trans historical in a certain way, right? This is something that's it's a deadlock or a contradiction that you're going to find in any society. I mean, beyond, like I said, the primitive communism, very small local tribe community thing. And that's the heart of it is, okay, there's people who have to do the shitty jobs, the shitty work, and then there's the people who get to reap all the benefit from it. And that takes on different forms throughout history. So yeah, it used to be the masters and the slaves, and then it's the feudal lords and the feudal serfs, and then it's the capitalists and the working class. But ultimately, this kind of perturbing, persistent contradiction or antagonism at the heart of society, that's what Slavoj is going to see as class struggle. And so, yeah, for him, he would say, you're not going to, I mean, you can have different types of ways of quilting the social field, but you want the one that is going to put that at the center, that's going to highlight that. Now, he understands that there's lessons to be learned about the failures from 20th century communism. And so it's like, what's he want? Just another go at communism? No, he doesn't. He thinks there's lessons we got to learn and face up to from what happened in the 20th century. But he also knows that, yes, no matter how we quilt or give consistency to the ideological order, there's ways to do it that highlight class struggle, and there's ways to do it that really, really hide it. And so even if we're still in ideology in the ways that we highlight class struggle in some sense, better to do that than to not do it.
Yeah. It makes me think of I don't know if you read Sartre's Critique of Dialectical Reason, but he kind of brings up the dialectic and like this sort of sublating totality as like a sort of necessary way of understanding this investigation of highlighting like class, but ultimately that's like class struggle is highlighted in the emergence of a totalizing event or a totalizing moment, and that like he gives a comparison of like, okay, like, let's talk about like hunger. It's not so much that like hunger is just a thing, but you can't just reduce it down to a series of like okay, there's salivation of the mouth, there's contracting and expanding of the stomach, and metabolic things like those multiplicities have to organize in such a way that something like hunger and eating are possible totalities. And then like he basically goes off this thing of need, and that need, if it's the necessary starting point, must as a totality sublate into a logical necessity, which is labor. And it's only labor then creates this instrumental field. It's almost like he's talking about equipment primordial. What it was the thing that Heidegger says, equipment
referential totality.
Referential totality. And so like this field of equipment that he talks about ends up producing these sort of social relations, which, as you're saying, end up boiling down to who's going to do the work and who isn't. And it's only now that like in the 20th century in capitalism that no matter how much of these different groups, marginalized identities, lumpen proletariats, they end up totalizing into this struggle of a praxis of freedom, which highlight in the totality, which is antagonistic of capital, of class struggle.
Yeah. No, and I mean, look, I mean, part of it is you can have a field, a political field quoted or quilted in such a way, um, to, you know, if you quilt it on the basis of identity politics, that's going to organize politics in a different way, which ultimately, even if certain groups pay lip service to class struggle, ultimately it's going to be on the back burner. It's not going to be the focal point. Um, you have other ways of quilting the political field to make that the primary thing. So it is. It like this is why Slavoj early on sees politics as almost like a game of signifiers, and the temptation is to go, oh, so you're just doing postmodernism, but no, his counter to that is like, no, you don't get the materiality of the signifier itself. This isn't linguistic idealism. It's the fact that signifiers carry material weight and structure our very institutions. And so whatever signifier has the primary position, or I've kind of toyed with this idea, an aristocracy of signifiers, because look, you can have one key signifier, but there's like a 12 under that one, that 10 that one. So I'm toying with all this stuff right now, but nonetheless, that's the point, is that the social field in a sense is up for grabs, and whatever consistent identity it's going to have in all of that, all of its contradictions and myriad differences, right? This is the second inversion thing. All of that field of complicated contradictory elements can be quilted in different ways and take on a different identity. And so it's like politics is an open game for who's going to do the quilting and requilting. But I mean, look, but like, I mean, so obviously, you know, this political thing and ideology, I mean, it structures our whole lives. And so, but there's also more lighthearted examples of this that we can see the functioning of quilting points. So let's kick pop culture for a second, right? Movie and television. So growing up in the 80s, I was a big fan of the first three Karate Kid movies. Okay. Now, the thing with the Karate Kid movies back then is, yes, there was a sort of consistency between them because all three were centered around the relationship between Daniel LaRusso and Mr. Miyagi. But other than that, there's not a whole lot of consistency. There's a little bit between 1 and 3. But what the new show Cobra Kai did was came back and provided, the show itself is a quilting point. And that's, I think, what is helpful here. I was kind of saying this earlier. It's weird to call an entire TV show a signifier, right? That's one of these weird problems with talking like this, is you want to go on one TV show as a signifier because you want to say, well, a signifier is a word. Well, a TV show is a multitude of episodes and dialogue and blah, blah, blah. But in Lacanese, yes, we can say a whole TV show is a signifier, right? And so, or a quilting point. And so what has been incredible is watching how the writers of Cobra Kai pulled off this epic requilting of the first three Karate Kid movies. They came back and provided so much cohesion and connection, like and that's the whole thing of the quilting point. It seems like it's necessary. Like, oh, the first three Karate Kid movies just had to culminate in Cobra Kai. But if we're doing the multiverse thing, there's some multiverse where Cobra Kai did not get made, and you're just left with the first three films. And so, I mean, part of what all of us who grew up with those films love so much about Cobra Kai is this retroactive consistency it provides the movies, right? But this is a thing that more and more of these IPs in Hollywood start doing. They retcon it, right? That's the term. And so, like, what is the meaning of retcon? Retcon is a shortened form of retroactive continuity and refers to a literary device in which the form or content of a previously established narrative is changed. So, Cobra Kai retconned the first three Karate Kid movies, and it did it basically flawlessly. But Hollywood is in the tendency of doing this, and there's times where it fails miserably. For example, The Rise of Skywalker, right? Okay, if anybody hasn't seen it, I mean, spoiler alert, I guess. But basically, look, they made choices with this sequel trilogy: Force Awakens, Last Jedi, Rise of Skywalker. J.J. Abrams made choices with Force Awakens, and then Rian Johnson made choices with Last Jedi, and it caused a lot of problems. And most of the Star Wars fans did not like these choices, and so they had to make a final retcon with The Last Jedi. Again, spoiler alert: 3, 2, 1. In it, they bring back Emperor Palpatine, who had originally been killed by Darth Vader at the end of Return of the Jedi. Now, issue is, by retconning or giving a retroactive continuity, re-quilting Star Wars in this way, they're so busy to keep the story going, they don't see how the later stuff nullifies or undoes some of the core aspects of the early stuff, right? So it said that Anakin Skywalker would bring balance to the Force. Well, okay, if in Force Awakens the First Order is there, well, it's some offshoot of the Empire. There's still not really balance brought to the Force. And then by the third sequel film, Rise of Skywalker, Palpatine is revealed to still be alive. So Vader didn't even kill his ass. And so it's like, well, what did he like? It creates problems with the lore, right? And this is the whole problem of keeping these IPs going in a sense beyond their expiration date, because now you're starting to retroactively fuck things up so much that it's so cluttered and such a mess that everybody loses interest in it. So it's almost like, if you want to give Hollywood a warning, it's like, you guys need to study Lacan and the quilting point to understand what you're doing to these IPs we love.
No, that's good. Yeah, and that's a good point with the Star Wars thing on how it fucks things up. But I really like the Cobra Kai example, because then you realize like how Kreese learned karate, and like the relationship between him and Silver, and like, you know, what how does their relationship go back, and then like you see like the sort of, you know, retroactive memory of like how he got into the military, what made him learn karate, and then how they in this newest season they brought Barnes back, you know,
Andrew,
and
like that's, I'm blown away. Like
yeah,
somebody can. What do you guys like this show so much? It's like it's like a soap opera. I don't care if you grew up with those first three films. This shit has been fucking amazing with how
yeah.
they pulled this shit together. It's the best retconning I've seen, and it does it makes those three films that I grew up with all the more enjoyable now. You know, the only thing they haven't done, and I'm still not, there's still a little bit of the last season. I think some's coming out this fall, and I think the last part of it is 2025 something, but they haven't brought in Hillary Swank as
Right, yeah.
and I'm
Because,
not going to be surprised if at some point she makes a cameo or shows up, plays some little role, just as like, here's the cherry on top. Now we even quilted in the
yeah.
next Karate Kid. I have to believe they're
Yeah.
gonna make that move.
Because it
Um,
still had Miyagi in there, even though if it was like a spinoff and Danielson was like, you know, nowhere to be, you know, involved in there, like it was still Pat Morihima or Morishima, whatever his last name is. But yeah, like it was still
yeah.
Mr. Miyagi. Um,
No, and I think they have to do it for him, right?
yeah,
It knits that film into, like, it's one of these things that in the future, if somebody wants to watch the Karate Kid saga, no, like they're gonna have to watch. Like, I won't even be surprised. Look, they're so great about integrating everything. I'm expecting Hillary Swank, and then I'm expecting maybe even Jackie Chan and uh Jaden Smith to be part of it somehow. I wouldn't even be surprised. Uh
that might be a
but
far stretch, but the Hillary Swank one was definitely, you know,
but
do
but no, like I've never seen a group of showrunners so good at navigating
right.
requilting or retconning, and it's amazing. So and then really, like, the last thing I want to say about this is just like, look, on a bit more serious, like when I was saying earlier, like our lives are structured by these quilting points. Um, two things come to mind. So on the one hand, like, this is the power of a religious conversion, right? There's this great quote from 2 Corinthians 5:17 where Paul writes, "Therefore, if any man be in Christ, he is a new creature. Old things are passed away. Behold, all things are become new." What he's talking about is when Christ becomes he who interpolates you or gives you a sense of duty, and now you're a Christian, all of your old things are like they've all been requilted in a new way in becoming a Christian, right? You're going to change how you treat people. You're going to change your attitude towards uh, your family, your small, like your whole world is going to be quilted anew, right? And this is the power of being interpolated with a new master signifier or quilting point. And I mean, you get another. This is what happened with Buddha, right? Um, he grew up in the temple. He leaves the temple, and then he has these three encounters. One with somebody, a corpse, so he encounters death. What's the three? Poverty is one of them, and
And
then
then Arahant, and then and a monk that he saw meditating. So he sees death, old age, and then a sadhu or arhat, whatever term you want to use.
okay, would that translate closely to poverty?
Yeah, well, yeah. So like it would be like a poor monk, pretty much. Yeah. So
Yeah.
like a sick person, old age, and then like a poor monk.
And think about it, like in these three encounters, it's not like a specific other person or even an institution came up to him and said, "Thou shalt go and find enlightenment so you can solve these three problems." He was interpolated by the situation itself. Like, but it changed his life forever. And he went about trying to figure out how to, solve these three core issues. Um, and so you can be requilted by a situation like a great encounter. But the other thing, like on a practical level, if somebody's like, okay, well, my life right now is kind of at a standstill, it's fragmented, I don't have any cohesion, I know that I need a greater purpose in my life. How do I, if somebody was, how do I requilt myself? And Žižek is great on this, where he's like, you don't do it just like, if you don't get the situational interpolation like Buddha, there's this more strategic everyday thing, which is you just do the ritual, right? And so he gets this from Pascal, but he says, look, if you're looking to change your life and you want to pursue being a Christian, yeah, you don't immediately have a sense of duty to God or whatever, but you start going to church, you start studying your Bible, you start praying, you do what a Christian does, and it's not guaranteed that real belief will take hold at this unconscious level. But this is a pragmatics that enables you to move towards a requilting, and you might have to experiment with different things. It might one thing isn't a surefire way to undergo a conversion of this type, but it is a thing of like kind of blind, stupid repetition of a ritual can actually produce the belief in the ritual. And you wake up one day and you go, wait a second, I'm a Christian now, and I didn't even realize, or I'm a Buddhist now, or I'm a communist now, right? Like it's the mechanism of the ritual itself that can produce the belief. It's not like I believe first and therefore I do the ritual. No, you do the ritual and then you end up having the belief. But this would, in a way, result in you having a requilted life. And but like look, I mean, and this is what people go through when they're having an existential crisis, right? The existential crisis is, I exist, but I don't know what to do with that, right? There's a sense of meaninglessness or directionlessness, and it's because there's no overarching quilting point or master signifier organizing that person's life. And one of the things though is like you can see this. I see this happen whether it's religious conversion or somebody becoming a parent. A lot of the times, the surest way for a person to change is if they have a kid, they find themselves being thrown into parenthood. That changes their whole sense of like what I should be doing in life, what I value, what I hope for the future. Like your whole world is requilted by your child, right? And so again, that's another reason why I'm saying like if somebody just wants to attack the institution of the family in a already atomistic society, that one sense of cohesion, you're trying to, what did Blade say? Motherfuckers trying to ice skate up a hill. If you try to attack the family as this last beacon of stabilizing meaning for most people, right? And this cuts across most races, right? The family unit it's still the, for white, black, Mexican, Asian, it's still that. So I'm just saying, I understand the importance of understanding things can be requilted, they can be reorganized. I understand seeing the problems in them, but if it's just a kind of childish, that bad, that must go, that's where the Lacanian conservatism comes out. It's like, okay, that's maybe not the best strategy if you're trying to really move things in a progressive way. So yeah, I guess that's what I've got.
It makes me think of the Vin Diesel memes. Nothing's more powerful than family.
Right, yeah, but it is. But think about it. Like, it's funny, and we all. I mean, it's Fast and Furious reference, but no, I mean, that is his quilting point. Like you really do want to understand the functioning of a quilting point. Yes, it's comical with him, but you watch those movies. It is his quilting point. It structures his every aspect of what he's doing in the world. So, you want to understand quilting point, go watch the Fast and Furious saga.
That's a great quilting point for this discussion, I think.
And I think the Fast and the Furious movies need a quilting point to stop it because they're doing
They
too much.
do.
They're doing
Yeah. Didn't they fucking go to space in one of them? I'm like, man, okay, I'm waiting for like Cthulhu to show up, and Vin Diesel's like, family. Like, so, well, guys, this has been fun. I'm glad we got a chance to finally do this.
No,
Finally.
yeah, no, it was good. It was definitely like in the making. Over determined.
Go pick up a recliner. So
yeah. All right. Well, I hope you all enjoyed that. Whoever watches this, I'm sure a lot of people will watch this because it's got the dangerous, maybe it's got Micky on it. So yeah, usually our guest appearances get a lot of views. So yeah, thank you again for coming on. Yeah.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate
Again.
it.
all right. Take it easy, guys. I'm gonna end it.
Peace.